All right, in this third and final video for week 2, I'm going to talk about the How Racism Takes Place selections that you read from the introduction of George Lipsitz's books, those first 5 pages, and then the selections you had from Catherine McKittrick's book, Demonic Grounds, as well as the post that I assigned is just to help kind of explain McKittrick's work a little bit. So again, I know that the readings this week were, kind of heavy, dense to get through. It won't always be like this, but some of these kind of more theoretical frameworks for our class, I wanted to kind of lay down up front. And so I'm just going to pull out for you a couple of the kind of key arguments and ideas, what I want you to take away from these 2 readings. So overall, the big thing here, Lipsitz is going to make a case for why we need to think about race and space together in the history of the U.S. And really make a case for what we're looking at for the rest of this course. And then McKittrick is going to talk, really explain not only what cultural geography is, but really the uniqueness of Black geographies. So that's just kind of a snippet of where we're going with these 2. So Lipsitz and How Racism Takes Place, he poses a question, or really a couple of questions, and that I think frames both a course like this and maybe what leads people like you to a course like this. So he first kind of goes through some history, and I've just given you some highlights here where we look at the history of chattel slavery in the U.S., well, in the colonies and then the U.S. We use that term chattel slavery to distinguish between slavery during that era and contemporary slavery, which still exists. You all are maybe familiar with the 13th Amendment and the way that you can still be a slave of the state. I think that's come up a lot in the news right now, in particular on the West Coast. There's a lot of discussion about the wildfires and how before the pandemic, prisoners were used to provide the labor to put out those fires, but now because of the pandemic, they aren't able to supply that labor. And again, I'm using the way that people talk about these in prison people. So still slavery today, but looking back at chattel slavery and the unique dynamics of that, which we'll get into next week, we're going to spend some time. I'll give you just a quick kind of overview of that. It's not a class where I can give you, as much in-depth as I really want to, but I'll give you a quick overview. But you're familiar, right? So there's that history. Then we can look at, the late 19th century, emancipation, Reconstruction, and then we get into the Great Northern Migration and a lot of Black people moving into cities. And then between the North and the South, we talk a lot about, Jim Crow segregation and the different ways that segregation and racism played out. This is all somewhat familiar history to people, right? But we often then look at that defining moment of the Civil Rights era, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, really in those kind of mid-1960s, the late 1960s, a lot of people look at that as solidifying kind of the legal rights that were denied for centuries to people of African descent in the U.S. So oftentimes, less so today because we're living in an era where we're watching social uprisings and seeing people gunned down by police, but still this question comes up that Lipsitz poses is how can it be that decades after the adoption of comprehensive civil rights laws like the ones I just mentioned, racial identity remains the key variable in shaping opportunities and life chances for individuals and groups in the United States? Why does race still matter so much? And I thought it was worth pulling out this quote because that's really the crux of what Lipsitz is getting at and why he turns his eye, and what we're going to do in this course, to the question of housing segregation and race in the U.S. He gives us that response, which we'll get to, but first he kind of walks through that question. And a lot of people have different responses to that, but there are some pretty dominant discourses out there, right? I think, again, we're seeing now a more dominant conversation about structural racism. There's been some acknowledgement of that on a kind of widespread public scale more recently, especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But you all are still probably very familiar with the dominant narratives, especially in the 80s and the 90s, and even in the 2000s, where people often said that, Black people have legal rights, and if they haven't improved themselves, it's really just because they haven't worked hard enough, right? Now that they have the same rights as everybody else, it comes down to culture and behavior. And that's a lot of, even now, people kind of have that, that discussion that if things haven't progressed enough, it's not the fault of, the country. The laws are there. It's just that people aren't working hard enough. Well, Lipsitz really, and why I assigned this to you, is he really deconstructs that notion. So you saw that NPR video, and he goes through a lot of that same history, where he talks about the fact that, through all the kind of public and private actions that helped accumulate wealth through housing, through, tax laws, through, all these different ways that wealth and privileges were built up before these civil rights laws, that didn't just end, right? We didn't undo any of that. So all that's happened over time is that it's fueled those racial disparities. He's arguing that, in fact, those gaps have only grown wider since then. And a lot of that comes down to the history of housing segregation. I'll come to this, but I want to get at, actually, let me go back, because I want you to look at that part where I say Lipsitz's response. Really what he's walking through, and I'm not gonna, you don't have to know all of these facts, because we're going to go through a lot of this history next, in weeks, 4 and 5, when we get into kind of the socio and economic and cultural history of housing segregation. But he gives that quick overview that yes, we can talk about slavery, yes, we can talk about Jim Crow segregation, and laws have changed that, but there's all these other things, right? So, he gave us a few facts that 46 million white adults today can actually trace their family wealth back to the Homestead Act of 1862. So if you're not familiar, that was a bill that gave away acres and acres of land to free white families, right? It's denied to other people of color. We talked in the other video about, again, the way that space was seen as this fundamental idea of freedom, especially for white Americans and people who came here to colonize. And so giving away that land allowed people to build up ownership and wealth, and that only grows over generations. If any of you have ever invested money, you know that almost always, if you invest money and you let it sit, or if you put it in a savings account, it just increases over time. And the same is true of generational wealth, right? So he talks about that fact. And then when we look just specifically at the history of housing segregation, he went over some of the same facts that NPR video does, that talked about federal loan programs that really radically changed the way we do mortgages, right? So now you all are familiar maybe with, like, people get the 30-year mortgage and you put, a certain percentage down. That didn't exist before. Not many people could own homes because you had to be able to put down 50% down payment, which, who can afford that? So those federal, programs really subsidize homeownership. And, as we know, 98% of those loans went to white families. So he talks about how over time that didn't just give wealth in terms of homeownership, but it gave tax funds to education. It gave access to certain jobs. It also helped people who build equity in their homes to take out loans for starting businesses or for retirement. So over time that just compounded and compounded itself. And he cites another scholar that says that today, right, well, now we're in 2020, this was written a little bit ago, they estimated that in the last 30 years, $7 to $9 trillion was passed down to white Americans, and that wealth is rooted in this history of homeownership and the wealth that was created from these policies. So there's a direct line from this history of housing segregation and the immense amount of wealth and opportunity and privileges it created for white Americans. And then on the flip side of that, what does that mean for Black Americans, right? If they didn't have that wealth, if they didn't get those privileges and access to those resources, yeah, we've changed the laws now, but practices, the the disparity in where people are starting from is so vast that we can't help but then see why we're continuing to have the same issues today. So that's really what he's getting at. Another kind of interesting fact that we'll circle back to is when he wrote this, the statistic was that Black Americans had 7 to 10% of the wealth of white Americans. It's actually 5% today. So even in the short amount of time that's passed from when he published to today, the gap is only getting bigger, right? So that's really a lot of what his argument is saying, yes, you have this history. Yes, we have progressed. We've moved on from chattel slavery. We've moved on from legal Jim Crow. People have legal rights, and those matter because it's a means that people can use to fight for their rights, right? If we didn't have the legal right to protest, although, yes, people are dealing with repression and things like that, but if we didn't have the right to sue, if we didn't have some of those laws, that helps. That is progress. It provides a certain amount of protection. But we're still seeing people gunned down in the street. We're still seeing incredible gaps in wealth and education. And he goes on to talk about even people who manage to get an education don't come off the same as their white counterparts. This is all traced back to this history of space and race in the US. So that's like the crux of what he's getting at. And again, for some of these concepts, don't worry, because I'm establishing them now, but we're gonna go over a lot of this history and these concepts so that, by the time you get to, say, your midterm exam, you're gonna know this well. So it's just gonna keep layering on top of itself. So a lot of what he's getting at, and I wanted to pull out before I move to the other essay, and again, this will be a shorter video, I'm sure you're glad, is what he calls the fatal coupling of place and race in the US. And so I'll read this quote because I think it's a good one, where he says, "When I say that racism takes place, I mean it figuratively in the way that historians do," right? So history happens, it takes place. But I also use the term as a cultural geographer does to describe how social relations take on their full force and meaning when they are enacted physically in actual places. By examining residential and school segregation, mortgage and insurance redlining, taxation and transportation policies, or the location of environmental amenities and toxic hazards, we talked a little bit about that, now that relates to health and race, we learn that race is produced by space and that it takes places for racism to take place. So what Lipsitz is getting at is that if we really want to talk about race, or in particular Blackness in the US, we really have to have conversations about space, and in particular, the history of geographic segregation, because it plays out into everything from your economic opportunity, the way you're perceived, your health, and life outcomes. All of this comes down to questions of space. And I think that is something that we don't often think about, right? So if you ask people today to talk about, the biggest issues that are, impacting the Black community, they might bring up, rightly so, questions of, incarceration and police violence. But even those are tied to space, right? And so that's really the main piece, the takeaway from this. And the way he kind of deconstructs this idea that, now that we have legal equality, people should have just pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, he goes on to really show that there's all these other things we don't often talk about in terms of space and economics and opportunity that make it so that it's almost impossible to close that gap unless we have major systemic change. And so a lot of that's what we'll be talking about, throughout the semester here. I do want to make one note that's not in the essay that he acknowledges in the rest of his book and other authors do. We're focused very much on the relationship between Blackness and space in this course, and there is a very unique history when it comes to, Black Americans, Blackness, and space in the US, right? But that's not to say that space isn't equally complicated for other groups. It's just different, right? So when you look, for example, at Indigenous communities and space, it's often been a relationship that's been about, segregation to the extreme of putting up people on reservations, or genocide, right? If you're familiar with the Trail of Tears and, other kind of violent things that have happened. Similar things happen with other communities and different immigrant groups, for example, were often segregated at first, but there's been some differences in the way those groups have been able to blend in or move Or we could talk about this if you're interested in office hours. People don't often realize that a lot of quote unquote ethnic neighborhoods, like, Chicago, for example, you'll have, the Polish neighborhood, the Irish neighborhood historically. Most people of that ethnic group didn't actually live in those neighborhoods, right? Which is very different from Black Americans, where the neighborhoods that were called Black neighborhoods, almost all Black people lived in those neighborhoods, right? So there's just some unique factors here, and I just want to make sure I acknowledge that this applies to and has affected other racial groups, but that in this course we're going to be looking at a very kind of specific and unique history when it comes to Black Americans. So the last thing I want to talk to you about, and this will be very short, so I know you'll be glad, is McKittrick's selections. And she, out of all of them, is the most kind of theoretical. And so I know that can be a lot. There's really just two major things I wanted you to take away from this, right? She is a cultural geographer and, has written a lot of really kind of brilliant pieces on these ideas. But for this course is really just two things, right? I want you to know what cultural geography is. So this is something that Lipsitz has talked about in both the space essay and then in these selections. So by now, again, we're layering. You should kind of know that when we talk about cultural geography, we're talking about an understanding of space as not just physical, right? But as all the things we imagine about a space and the people who inhabit it, the social practices built within that space, and then the identities that are formed there. So cultural geography is really just about understanding space as more than just that physical reality, but as a social, cultural entity as well. Black geography, and this is the other key takeaway from her work, is that she looks at Black geography as the study of Black space as a site of kind of contestation. What I mean with that, and this is similar to Lipsitz and how he talks about the Black spatial imaginary, right? Very similar kind of concepts here, is that on one hand, we can look at geography and its study and its use as a way that was displaced Black people, right? So you can look at the transatlantic slave trade, and there's been lots of writing about, the Middle Passage, and, down to physical, tangible ways people were thrown into the sea or killed or died, how space became this perilous thing for people, right? Or the plantation and plantation life and how that shaped, the Black experience in the U.S. Yes, it was meant to do those things, but she argues that Black geographies are so much more dynamic and complicated than that. That the people living there, and she focuses on Black women in particular, but Black people in general, have always used space to contest and fight for the own meanings of their lives, right? To give it its own meaning, right? So good examples of that. I put two pictures here. One is of the Cotton Club, which you may or may not be familiar with. The Cotton Club was originally only, no Black people were allowed in it, but over time, Black artists came to perform there, and they made it what it was, right? The Cotton Club was like the hottest place in town because you had Louis Armstrong and Lena Horne and all these famous Black artists that would come and perform there. So it's a good example of the way that Black Americans took a space that was meant to be a space of exclusion, and they took it to be a place where they became the stars, and they were the ones who created the value of attending that club. Another example, and this is actually from an exhibit at the Schomburg in 1968, but when you talk about, different spaces like in Harlem, right, where a lot of ways that was a space that came out of Great Migration and attempts to segregate Black people, but Black people took that space and they made it into one where they could form their own cultural identity and affirm their value. From the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement to the Black Arts movement and the Black Power movement to today, you see that the space, that the Black geography of places like Harlem or Chicago or Minneapolis or Oakland are spaces where people kind of contest, and it's not just about, the way they're policed or the way that they are given less opportunities or resources, but also the ways that they create community and value and belonging in spite of those conditions. And I think that kind of dynamic is something that we are going to focus a lot, especially the second half of this course, in looking at the ways that Black people have taken space and added different meanings that weren't originally meant to be given to the people who live there. So that is all I have on those two. Again, there's a lot of stuff going on in the readings this week. I know that it was a lot more theoretical, but I think hopefully by now you have a good sense of the key kind of concepts, the way we're going to be talking about Blackness, the way we're going to be talking about space, the way we're going to be talking about housing segregation, and why we're talking about housing segregation instead of, you might think, well, why aren't we talking about police brutality, or, why aren't we talking about slavery? We definitely will, but all of these things can be connected back to these ideas of space. So that is it in a nutshell. Again, if you have questions, feel free to send me an email or to come to office hours. I will continue to post videos like these each week that walk you through kind of the key concepts and then readings. So if you ever are reading through something and you're like, I'm not sure I'm getting what I'm supposed to get out of it, don't worry, because I will always post videos to help guide your understanding of these.